Unlike Disney, Pixar isn't as well known for their villains, particularly because most of them aren't conventionally done ones and are more apt to be revealed via plot twist rather than made clear from their first scene that they're going to be the bad guy. And because of that, they don't really tend to drive the story the same way that most villains do, as well as why Pixar can famously get along without a villain just as well as they can with one. Now obviously Pixar has had many great and iconic villains that can stand alongside Disney's best. But the point here is just that not too many of them are villains in the more conventional sense. And that's what leads right into Hopper from A Bug's Life. Because out of all of Pixar's villains that they've made, he might just be the most standard among them, and therefore makes him stand out from all the others the company has to offer. And today, I'd like to go over Hopper's character and look at what makes him such a black sheep compared to most Pixar villains. And obviously there will be spoilers for A Bug's Life, as well as quite a few other Pixar movies ahead. So if you haven't seen any of them yet, but plan to, you might want to come back to this video another day. This will be the only spoiler warning I'll be giving out. Okay, so perhaps the best way to describe what makes Hopper the odd one out as far as Pixar villains go is to take a deep dive into what a normal Pixar villain looks like. Because when Pixar does have a villain in one of their movies, they're usually either a plot twist villain or start out as simply a menace but become a bigger threat as the movie goes on. So as a result, you'll very rarely find a mustache twirling bad guy that makes it clear from the second he appears that he's the villain of a Pixar film, but Hopper is the exception to that. From the moment he shows up, the audience knows that he is bad news and the source of all the ants' problems. And with the exception of Cars 2, he's the only Pixar villain to do that. Because in such cases as Chick Hicks, Skinner, or Urkel, they don't start off as evil, but more so an annoyance, and it only becomes clear that they are the villain later on, even if the narrative doesn't try to hide what their eventual role will be. Even somebody like Sid, who's made out to be pure evil from the start, doesn't know the toys are actually alive and is making them suffer, and thus he's only evil by toy standards and is therefore similarly unconventional. But because it is clearly telegraphed from the beginning that Hopper's the bad guy, he also gets to do something that most other Pixar villains don't. He drives the entire plot. Because as I keep emphasizing, in most Pixar movies, the villain doesn't really take stage until at least the halfway point, and as a result don't have a direct impact on the narrative until that point. Now, there are of course other exceptions to this, such as Randall and Henry J. Waternoose in Monsters, Inc., or the Lemons in Cars 2, but even then, there are plot twists and surprises to be had. But with Hopper, what you see is what you get. The narrative is much more straightforward and simple than is normal for a Pixar film. Though as I noted in another video, which you can find a link in the description to, that isn't really a bad thing. But the point is, Hopper is the entire reason that the plot exists. He is why the ants gather the food, that Flick loses it trying to help them collect it faster, that they recruit the circus bugs to help them. Everything the characters do is the direct result of Hopper's actions. And similarly, this is why his death is pretty much what single-handedly causes the movie to have a happy ending, since he's no longer around to cause problems. To put it simply, if you remove Hopper from the story, you have no movie, which is the exact opposite of a lot of Pixar movies, to the point that it's sometimes been argued that the inclusion of a villain in some of their stories was unnecessary because the conflict worked just fine without them. But what only makes Hopper stand out from other Pixar villains even more is that he doesn't directly tie into the theme of his movie. Now, I already covered this extensively in my video on Disney villain defeats, and I'll leave a link to that video in the description as well if you want to get a better handle on what I'm talking about. But to quickly summarize it here, most Pixar movies that have a villain will usually be tied to the hero in some way, and their defeat often directly corresponds to that somehow. Like Ernesto de la Cruz wanted to be famous, loved, and admired, so his comeuppance is being hated by everybody. Or Chick Hicks is what Lightning McQueen would have become if he hadn't learned his lesson, which is only further reinforced by how Hicks loses by winning, just for a few quick examples. But once again, none of this applies to Hopper at all. He is not a dark reflection of Flick, or in any way tied to him thematically, and his defeat similarly has nothing to do with his particular motivation or wants beyond just not wanting to die, which can be said for 99% of villains out there. Honestly, Hopper has much more in common with a classic Disney villain than most Pixar bad guys to come out in the years that followed, which is especially obvious if you've seen the aforementioned video, as the similarities are glaring. However, that isn't to say that he isn't a well-done villain, because he is. I mean, as a person who's written books, I can safely say that things become conventional in writing for a reason, because they often work very effectively. So the fact that Hopper is a much more standard villain than Pixar's usual fare isn't automatically a condemnation of him, just an observation of how different he is. Because he honestly fills his role in the story perfectly, and as I brought up in my video where I compare A Bug's Life to Ants, which you can also find a link in the description to, I even said that the villain was one of the only things that Pixar unquestionably did better than DreamWorks. Because while Hopper and General Mandible are in many ways very similar, there's two things that easily makes Hopper the better villain. The first being, General Mandible's motivations are a bit hard to understand, as it's difficult to tell if his actions are fueled by bigotry, a desire for power, plain old megalomania, possibly narcissism, or maybe even a combination of everything I just said. And because of that, it's almost impossible to make out what the character is all about, while Hopper's motivations and mentality are spelled out crystal clear. And that leads right into the second thing that makes him a better villain than Mandible by a landslide: the grain scene. Because simply put, this scene is what made the character, and quite possibly the entire movie as well. First, Hopper demonstrates how the ants aren't dangerous on their own, but if they were to all attack at once, then the grasshoppers wouldn't stand a chance. Then he further makes this clear by outright stating that he knows this to be the case, and that he's driving the ants like slaves because he simply loves having power over those weaker than him. Honestly, this scene not only highlights just how evil he is, but also that he's extremely smart, as he doesn't let his arrogance or hunger for power blind him to just how fragile his hold on the ant colony is. And indeed, the biggest reason he loses later on is because he goes too far in the other direction and insults and belittles the colony to such an extent that they stop taking him seriously and realize that he's full of baloney. Had he focused more on menace and intimidation, then the ants would have probably never realized just how powerful they really were against the grasshoppers. But the other reason that scene is so well remembered is how applicable it is to several real-life scenarios. The designated few who bully large numbers of people rely on fear and intimidation tactics to keep their targets from rising up against them all at once. And above all, never give their victims a break, because it might cause them to stop being afraid and realize that they have the power and not those who push them around. And the fact that that scene, as well as Hopper's line, "You let one ant stand up to us, then they all might stand up," has often been compared to several real-world incidents, only further shows just how effective this scene was in getting its point across. Particularly because he actually kills the grasshoppers in question to send his message, which not only reinforces just how dangerous the ants actually are, but also the lengths Hopper will go to keep his power over them. And it's honestly that realism surrounding his character that helps make him such a memorable villain, as well as his biggest similarity to Pixar's other bad guys. Because one thing that pretty much all of Pixar's villains have in common is that they're written to be as true to life as possible. Almost any villain of theirs could actually exist in the real world and are meant to reflect people who are actually evil, and Hopper is no exception to that. Sure, he's way more obviously evil than other Pixar villains, but he doesn't need to put on airs of civility, and even uses his brutish nature to intimidate everybody into submission. So his more over-the-top nature actually makes sense. In the end, he's a surprisingly accurate portrayal of a person obsessed with power and not afraid to hurt anyone to get it just so long as he benefits from it. And that helps make him stand out. Now, I know I've spoken at length in the past about how realism is used too much, especially in children's entertainment, but in this case it was a better direction to take the character because it makes him more memorable. Sure, most of the time kids' movies are better off with the evil just for evil's sake classic Disney villain type villains, but Hopper did benefit from being presented as more true to life, especially when you compare him to General Mandible. But even apart from that, and as I noted before, he does everything that's required of him as a villain perfectly. He drives the whole plot, has a spelled out motivation that makes him scarier, and is an undeniably credible threat to the main characters. Like I already said, just because he's a way more conventional villain than most of Pixar's other bad guys doesn't mean he was badly done overall, as he might just be one of the best and most memorable characters in the entire film. It's just that when comparing him to later Pixar villains, Hopper tends to stand out as a black sheep because he's much more normal than what came after him, and the fact that he still worked makes him very interesting, as well as serves to show that at least when Pixar knows what they're doing, they can make even a conventional villain rather fascinating to watch. Now, if only their way of doing bad guys hadn't completely screwed up Disney's own tried and true villain formula. But let's not even get into that discussion again. Okay, I think I've made my point here. So now let me hear what you guys think. Do you believe that Hopper may just be the most conventional villain in Pixar history, even if he's still a very well done one? Or do you believe he's more in line with the kind of bad guys Pixar usually makes than I was letting on? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. Because as I say all the time, you don't have to agree with any opinions expressed in this video if you happen to think that they were wrong. You can feel about both Hopper and Pixar villains in general however you want to, and if you think I couldn't have been any more wrong, that is totally fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all very appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.